Hello, I'm Dan Gibson, and this is the sixth video and the last video in the series Navigation and the Kiblat. In this video series, we have introduced the method that the ancient Arabs used to determine the Kiblat direction. This method was not invented by Muhammad or the new Muslim community. By their time, in 800 AD, it was already a very old method, having been established many hundreds years earlier. Way back in 70 AD, at the height of the Nabatean Empire, Pliny the Elder was told by the Arabs that the trip from Timna, the capital of Qataban in Yemen, to Gaza in the Mediterranean Sea was 2,437,500 steps, or 62 days, or 2,500 kilometers. The Nabateans were not simple merchants or camel drivers taking a few goods from one city to another. I think that's a mistake that's often purported by people who want to demean the Arabs and their accomplishments in their history. The Nabatean Empire was very different. It was different from other empires. It was not built on military might with borders that advanced and now you're entering Nabatea. It was built on economic strength and control of resources. The Nabateans had built a network of trading emporiums all across the Middle East and into Europe. Nabatean families would set themselves up just outside of a foreign city, and they would have their house there and they would have room to store goods. Then they would seek out trade goods produced in that city or that region, and when the price was low, they would purchase and hold those goods waiting for the camel caravans. When the camel caravans arrived, they would send those goods that they had collected to other places, and they would unload goods from other places that would bring good prices in their city. Many of the Nabatean merchants did not sell directly to the public, but sold in bulk to the local merchants. In many ways, they were the original wholesale distributors. Evidence of small Nabatean communities like this have been found near many of the major cities all through the Mediterranean region and beyond, some even in Italy itself. But some of the suppliers, such as the incense coming from Yemen, required a long and difficult trip across the desert. Now, most of the deserts in the Middle East are like huge flat plains of gravel with some rocky areas in them. The great sand dunes you see pictures of are mostly in one small area. However, there is one large area that's known as the empty quarter because it's made up mostly of sand dunes that blow and shift, but across the same flat, rocky plain. That flat area was perfect for the Nabatean merchants who realized that the farther north they moved, the higher the North Star rose in the sky. And the farther south they traveled, the further down the North Star hung in the sky. It wasn't long before they were measuring the height of the North Star with their fingers extended out at arm's length, and this was the beginning of their fascination with the stars. At the same time, the only way to get an accurate measurement of the distance they had traveled was to count their steps as they walked. Remember, camels carried goods in both directions, and the camel drivers walked so that the camels could carry maximum loads. And so the Arabs learned to chant poetry or stories while walking beside their camel caravans. It helped with the rhythm of the walking, but more importantly, each poem or long, easily remembered story had a known length. They knew how many beats were in the story. When they started out on a long poem or story, they could stop counting, because when the story ended, they knew the number of steps they had taken by the number of beats in the poem or story. Over time, many of these poems and stories were lost, but some were remembered and centuries later were retold and became part of a collection of stories that eventually became the 1001 Nights. Now, not all of the stories in the 1001 Nights are from the Arabs, but some of the stories are. And some of the earliest Arabic poetry found its way into that collection. On top of this, there are what were known as the hanged poems, which supposedly were created in pre-Islamic times. These stories have been translated into English or other languages, and so when we hear the translation, we don't hear the rhythm of the poetry. I have a collection of stories here behind me that the Arabs had. There's 6 volumes of Arabic poetry from very early times. In the Bedouin village, I would often hear people quote these stories from memory, and in every case, they were like poetry, with rhythm and beat. And these are the kinds of stories that the caravan masters knew and used to keep the rhythm as they walked along and to measure the number of beats that the caravan took. Now, the caravan master, he knew the poems and he would start people out, but in Europe, where they walked, they didn't sing, they used a drum, and it was known as the walking drum. Boom, 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 and so everybody could walk along in rhythm, and it helped with the rhythm. But in the Middle East, the caravans were known as the singing caravans because the people were chanting this poetry as they went along, and that's how they kept their rhythm. So with all of this information that the Arabs gathered, they knew distance, they knew the height of the stars, and so the caravan, as it moves along, they could determine the direction they were heading, and they could do some calculation. At nighttime, they would choose the next night stopping place where it would be. In the morning, they would head out for that place, and it would be over the horizon, but they had the tools to help them to cross the vast deserts and arrive at exactly where they wanted to go. So it was not hard for them to take the navigational tools that they developed over the centuries and use them in the new religion. When Muhammad directed them to face a certain place far over the horizon, it was not impossible for them to do because there were men among them who had the tools and the knowledge to do this. You see, the Quran does not command the followers of Allah to do something they could not do. Allah was not expecting them to do the impossible. The first generation of Muslims had the knowledge and the ability to orient their mosques with a reasonable degree of accuracy. They didn't require absolute exact information. Getting within a couple of degrees was sufficient because they would line up in a long, wide row facing the Qibla direction. When we use the Qibla tool and examine some 160 mosques, starting from the very first mosque built in Medina, we can see a pattern of accuracy. They didn't choose random directions. They didn't copy something they saw or imagined when visiting Mecca and then incorporate it into their mosque at home. The Qiblas of the ancient world were systematic. That's why it's important to understand the story that the archaeological evidence presents to us today. You see, in the Middle Ages, Islamic leaders had purified the story of the founding of Islam. Islam was no longer conquering great swaths of land. Now Islam was being spread ideologically, and preachers, not military commanders, were leading the way. And the preachers preached a message of a pure Islam. They preached that the Quran had descended from heaven rather than it was being revealed a little bit at a time to Muhammad during his lifetime. Some of the more embarrassing events during the rise and development of Islam were covered over. For instance, General Hajjaj and his invention of the wasat, or the middle or between Qiblas, were no longer mentioned. And within a generation of two, they were forgotten, and a politically correct version of the story of the founding of Islam was believed by everyone everywhere. And so when confronted with strange Qiblas, people imagined that the early Muslims were clueless about how accurately to face themselves when they prayed. This belief about early Muslims being unable to correctly follow the command of Allah and face Masjid al-Haram was suggested by some of the medieval mathematicians and astronomers. When they saw some of those early Qiblas, it seemed to them they're just so inaccurate, and so their assumption was those guys didn't know what they were doing back then. After all, the medieval scholars were trying to convince people of their day that mathematics and astronomy were superior to whatever the ancients used. Now, even today, this idea of the early Muslims being ignorant of how to set a Qibla and being happy to just select some aspect of the Kaaba building and replicate it at home, this has been propagated today by the likes of Dr. David King. He strongly argues that the first generation of Muslims had no way of knowing how to set Qiblas, and any appearance of systematic Qiblas is simply by chance. And so Dr. King challenges the Muslim world, and he challenges all Muslim scholars everywhere to demonstrate to him how the early Muslims could have established their Qiblas with any degree of accuracy. And so that's what this video series is all about. And we have demonstrated in the first 5 videos that the first generation of Muslims did indeed have the tools and the ability to accurately set their Qiblas using something known as the Indian Circle. In this video, we want to explore 2 further and final questions. First, since the Indian Circle did not take into consideration the curvature of the surface of the earth, how much error would that have introduced into their Qiblas? And second, if the first generation of Muslims used poor quality counting of steps, and they got that mixed up, how badly would that have affected their Qibla setting? So first, the curvature of the earth. Let's look at this graphic made by a mathematician, statistician. I asked him to graphically represent the difference between the true Qibla that takes into account the curvature of the earth and the Qibla direction given by the Indian Circle. This assumes that the first generation of Muslims had accurate data, so in this graphic we're just testing the accuracy of the Indian Circle method itself. Later we'll look at the accuracy of the data they had. The lighter areas in this graphic are the most accurate, and the darker areas are where there is the most error. As you can see, the farther east or west one goes, the greater the error. By the time one reaches India in the east or Morocco in the west, the error introduced is as much as 10 degrees. So if they used the Indian Circle in Morocco, the result would have been facing 10 degrees farther south than they should have. The same is true in India. If the Indian Circle was used there, in North India, the Qibla that they faced would have been 10 degrees farther south than it should have been. Now remember, we're comparing the difference between the direction based on the Indian Circle and the actual direction based on GPS coordinates that take into account the spherical shape of the Earth. In the graphic, we are using a Qibla based on Masjid al-Haram built in Petra. We did it built on Mecca as well. We compared them both, and so it doesn't matter. I'm just choosing here if they were using one based in Petra. And just notice that directly north and south where the Indian Circle would be, that would be the most accurate. It's the lightest in color. Notice also that there is sort of a circular area where the Indian Circle would be more accurate. You see that around the north. Outside of that, there are places where it's less accurate. The reason for this is the curvature of the earth. Now, let's go to the Kiblat tool on the Nabatea website, and let's have a look at this. So you click on a Nabatea website, and then you go down and click and have a look at the Kiblat tool. And will show us different directions. And on the right-hand side of every location, we show the direction to Mecca, to Petra, to Jerusalem, and to the Wasit, or the between Qibla. Then we provide options so we can see, first of all, the farthest extent that the sun would go during the summer or winter. Those are the solstices. We can put that on and turn that on or off and see if that has anything to do with the Qibla. Below this, we have added 3 more options. For each position, we provide an option to see the Qibla direction that resulted from the Indian Circle method. For each of these, you can turn them on or off and see the result on the map. So let's choose Anjar. I chose Anjar because it's the easiest to see. It's large in size, has no interfering buildings, plus it has an inscription that tells us that it was built in the year 95 after the Hijrah. The entire complex is oriented in one direction, including a mosque near the center. It's a good place to illustrate what takes place when we consider the Indian Circle. So we'll zoom in. The blue line shows us the orientation of the complex and of the mosque. The four other lines show us the GPS directions to Jerusalem, that's in black, Petra is in red, the between Qibla is in yellow, and the green Qibla for Mecca. I have classified Anjara as being a Petra Qibla because it is the closest. Now let's click on the solstice. You can see it doesn't seem to have anything to do with this structure at all. So if we're zoomed all the way in, I will click on the Mecca Indian Circle option, and then I can compare it to the city, the Qibla that points directly to Mecca using the GPS. Now, if I click on the between, I can see what would have been almost exactly right if I use the Indian Circle. If I click on the Petra option on the Indian Circle, I would have produced a Qibla, if I was using the Indian Circle, I would have produced a Qibla a little bit west of the real Petra Qibla. And this is very close to the Qibla that was actually used in 95 after the Hijrah at this location. Now, if we move farther west into Africa, what will happen then? So let's go about halfway across Africa, zoom over here, and then we're going to check out the Qibla of Zuwayla. It was built about 68 after the Hijrah. The blue line shows the Qibla of this mosque. And if I turn on the GPS for Petra, I can compare it with the Indian Circle. Notice the Qibla would point to a bit farther south, but it does not explain the mosque and its Qibla. If I turn off the Petra Qiblas and turn on the Mecca Qibla and then the Indian Circle, it's a little bit closer. It still doesn't explain the Qibla that's being used by this mosque. So let's go a little farther west. Let's go all the way over to Cordoba. It was built in 168 after the Hijrah. So if I get there and zoom in a little bit, and I can turn on all the GPS units, I can see, but they don't explain to us the Qibla of this mosque. So I'm going to turn them all off, except for Mecca, and then I'm going to add the Indian Circle. It still doesn't explain the Qibla of this mosque. Even by taking into account the spherical error in the Indian Circle method, it does not explain the Qibla used in Africa and Spain. To understand the Qibla used in North Africa and in Spain, please see the video that I've recorded on the parallel Qiblas. Those videos tell the story of how this Qibla was developed. Look specifically for the Qibla story and then for the video that's on the parallel Qibla. Because at that very same time that these Qiblas were being set, Al-Hajjaj was developing his Wasat, or between Qibla. And so there were a number of Qibla options that people had. Now, just one more graphic here. What would have happened if the Arabs had used Ptolemy's measurements of the earth? He mismeasured the earth and got it too small. That's why Christopher Columbus thought that China was really much closer than it was. And so he thought he was going to bump into China, and he didn't bump into China. He bumped into America. I didn't even know the world was that big because of a mistake made by Claudius Ptolemy. And so if the Arabs were using Claudius Ptolemy's coordinates rather than actual coordinates and seeing the world as smaller, this is what that graphic would help us see, the world being smaller. The Indian Circle would have been much more accurate. Erring on the side of longitude being too short would have evened out the error introduced by not calculating the curvature of the earth. Now let's review. The early Arabs were traveling merchants who used the stars and counting steps to navigate across the deserts of the Middle East. When Muhammad revealed the Quran verses commanding the faithful to face Masjid al-Haram and having their Qibla set to Masjid al-Haram, they had no problem in doing this because as desert navigators, they already had the tools in hand. Using their measurements of the height of the North Star and the counting of steps as caravans moved across the desert, they could accurately determine where Masjid al-Haram was, even when it was hundreds of miles away over the horizon. Today, a few scholars dismiss the Indian Circle as an inaccurate tool because it did not take into account the curvature of the earth. The Indian circle treats the world as if it were a flat surface. But as we have shown, the greatest error that would have been introduced is 10 degrees for mosques that were at the far end of Morocco on one side or Pakistan on the other. Now, by 900 AD, when it became widely known that there was something odd or wrong with the Qiblas of the first generation of Muslims, it was assumed that their method was bad. So Muslim scholars were looking for more accurate ways to determine the Qibla. They wanted new techniques rather than the old ones. The whole focus was on mathematics and science, and use that to find the Qibla rather than on history. They couldn't imagine that in history they might have been accurate back then. They just saw all these inaccurate Qiblas. They had no idea there were multiple Qiblas, 4 different Qiblas back in the early days. Now, let's deal with one more question. Many people have questioned and have even made fun of the Qibla that was set in Guangzhou in China. My research has been ridiculed by some people, and they've had various reasons for this. One, they say the Arabs wouldn't have even been in China, and that they wouldn't have built a mosque during the lifetime of Muhammad. Now, I've tried to demonstrate this in my videos and on the website, that there have been, and there was an exchange of explorers and merchants between Arabia and China going back to as early as 100 BC. People who make fun of the Arab-China connection are simply ignorant of the historical connection between these civilizations. There were 2 routes to China. This is number 2 that people ridicule. One was across land using the Silk Route, and this route was actively used during the time of the Roman Empire. The second was the maritime route between China and the Arabs. You can check out these routes on my website, nabatea.net. For instance, just click on Explore, then Travel, then Trade, and then the Maritime Sea Route, and you can check that out. Third, people have ridiculed the Guangzhou Mosque Qibla because they say there's no way the Arabs could have calculated the Qibla. But I disagree. Measuring the North Star, they would have discovered that the mosque in China was a little south of the city of Petra, the Masjid al-Haram in Petra. They didn't need to know exactly how far they were from the Middle East, and although merchants who were walking on the land route would have had a good idea by counting steps, and I'm sure they shared that information, but the mosque builders could have estimated and faced their mosques a little north of straight west, and they would have been very close to the actual Qibla. I hope I have been able to demonstrate that the first generation of Muslims were not ignorant and unable to obey the commands of Allah to face Masjid al-Haram whenever they prayed. I firmly believe they had the tools and the ability to set accurate Qibla directions for their mosques, accurate at least to the average of 3 or 4 degrees. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video, the last video in the series Navigation and the Qibla.